Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today and talk about one of my favorite things, Scotland. Basically, I was kind of drawn to this topic because people think of Scotland as kind of one place, and it's really kind of a divided country. The Lowlands and the Highlands have historically different attitudes about all kinds of things. The early inhabitants of the Lowlands were not the same ones that were the inhabitants of the Highlands, and they came with some different cultural ideas, and over time the political characteristics of the two regions have changed. Now in modern times they're kind of fusing together a little bit more, but in the beginning it was not that way. So they're just very distinctly different. The Highlands were where the language was Gaelic, and the Lowlands spoke a combination of languages that really were more like whatever was going on in England, because basically the lowlands of Scotland were inhabited by people that had kind of been pushed up through England as various tribes in the earliest times were kind of forced off of the continent, mainly I'd say by the actions of Caesar, who was trying to take over that area. So they wound up not even speaking the same language, but living very near one another. And they came together over time because England was constantly kind of after them and picking on them, I'd say. And it was in self-defense that they finally united. Basically, throughout their history, England was in their politics and trying to bring them into the English fold. Pretty much what England had done with Ireland, as a matter, I suppose, of protection for that country, for England, to have those surrounding them closest so that they could be with them. So the geography is, how do I do this pointer? I didn't try it before. Ooh, sorry. I'll go back to that. I'm using Manuel's pointer, not my own. Is there the hell? Oh, there we go. Okay. So basically, the Highlands sort of go from here to here, all the way north. And the Lowlands go from that point to the English border where Hadrian's Wall is. So when you go to Scotland, you start to think, well, how do they call this the Lowlands and the Highlands? Because it's a lot of mountains wherever you go. It just happens, I think, the Lowlands came to be called the Lowlands more because they were lowered in terms of they're closest to England. And but the mountains are a little smaller there. The highest peaks there are about 800, and when you get up into the Highlands, the peaks get up a little over 1,300. So this is a map to give you maybe a little more grounding as to where these places are. The Highlands are kind of going from there to there, would be a dividing line. This is where the mountains start to get a little taller. It's the Grampian mountain range. So who inhabited this area? Basically, they were Celtic tribes that had moved in, but they were different Celtic tribes. Some of you may have heard these Celtic tribes referred to as the Seven Nations. Sometimes they're called the Six Nations. That's because you have to look at different ways of grouping them. In Scotland, the Lowlands were the Brythonic Celts. They spoke a language that is closely related to the English that we speak today here in the United States. The Celts that wound up migrating to Brittany, which is in the northern part of France, and Cornwall and Wales, also spoke this Brythonic language, although the Welsh wound up changing that a little bit over time. And the Scottish Highlands were Gaelic speaking. The Scottish Highlands were more like the Picts that lived in the very northernmost part of Scotland, also spoke Gaelic. And of course in Ireland, Irish Gaelic was spoken. Slightly different than Scottish Gaelic, but they can understand one another. And on the Isle of Man, the language of Manx was spoken. Now the Iberian Peninsula, Spain basically, there are no Celtic languages spoken today, but that is sometimes referred to as one of the 7 Celtic nations. So it becomes a matter of semantics. Are they speaking Celt? Is anyone in the country speaking a Celtic language today? But these were the tribes that kind of migrated from Europe. They originated in what's called the Celtic Heartland, which is Hallstatt, basically. And this map kind of shows how they started to really go all over Europe. The arrows don't continue the way I would like on this particular graphic, but these were the Gaelic people came and went to Ireland, and then up to where the Picts were located, and then down here to the Highlands. And the Brythonic speaking went from basically up through England and then made their way up into a little bit past Hadrian's Wall, which is the border between Scotland and England. So Highland society revolved around agriculture, basically. They had a system called crofting. And this system called crofting, there was a Highland chief. Basically, he was benevolent, leader, family head, who kind of managed the land and was kind of ruled benevolently, as I said, over the clans. They were his extended family. And so this is where you hear about clans in Scotland. You don't really hear about clans in the Lowlands. And their language was Gaelic, and farming was the big thing. And this is where tartans originated. But the tartan isn't quite like what we see today. The tartan that they were wearing basically in battle was a little patch of fabric associated with their clan. And it was just so you could basically know who the good guys were and the bad guys were when you were in a battle. You knew who was on your side. And they also were big on playing a thing called the bagpipes, which we all now know is and think of as just, you think of bagpipes and you think of Scotland. But the bagpipes were also played in other Gaelic areas. The Irish used bagpipes too. But bagpipes, the purpose of bagpipes was not a musical purpose. It was a battle cry. It was a warning, we're on our way. It's kind of a frightening sound if you think about it. It's not, I don't personally think it's that pleasant to listen to. Many will disagree with me. But it was just a warning, we're on our way. We're here to battle you. So the tartan and the bagpipes were both associated with battle. And the Lowlands didn't really have those types of clans. Over time, population growth in the Highlands started to make that system not work so well. The land got very crowded. A clan would have a certain area designated for them, and as they had children, and then they needed more farmland, and so on and so forth. And it's an agricultural region, the Highlands, but if you think about farming in the mountains, it's going to be limited. And the land was basically owned by lairds and stuff that lived in the Lowlands or in England. And they started to realize they weren't getting a return on their investment of this property that actually had been given to them by the King of England or different kings and rulers over time. And they wanted to turn it into a sheep farming area, which would be more profitable for them, and have many of the people move away, and just told them to kind of scoop, go become fishermen and all kinds of things. So it forced the Highlanders to live on smaller and smaller plots, and the lairds began a thing called the land clearances around 1750. But But needless to say, okay, so the Lowlands, that is where all the intellectual stuff is going on, basically. Actually, about 70% of Scots live in the Lowlands. And that's where the major universities wind up. Edinburgh and Glasgow were centers of culture. During the Enlightenment era, there were many progressive ideas that generated from here that we all know about today, study them in one way or another. A lot of art and literature going on down there. And they considered themselves, at least the upper crust in this region, considered themselves to be more British than Scottish. And they spoke the same language. They went to London for culture. But this area, I say they spoke English, but they were kind of a mixture, just the way England was, of Anglo-Saxons and the Brythonic Celts and other tribes that had been forced off the continent. So, but by 800 AD, English is the language spoken in this area, and still Scottish Gaelic is the language spoken in the Highlands. So you basically had two different groups of people that really could communicate with one another. Also, with a very different society, agricultural society, intellectual, artistic society in the Lowlands. Needless to say, the Lowlanders didn't think too highly of the Highlanders. They thought them to be backward and such. So this is just kind of a really abbreviated timeline of Scotland. A big thing was the Battle of Bannockburn. It's still celebrated today by Scots. This was kind of a revolt against the English. But then by 1603 you have the Union of the Crowns. That's where the two, the Lowlands and the Highlands were forced to basically become part of England. That law is very shaky throughout history and still has its moments. And then along comes the Scottish Reformation, 1630, 1707, going along with the Reformation that's going on in Europe. This form of the Scottish Reformation took its cues from John Calvin. It was Calvinistic Presbyterianism. Okay, what ends the Scottish Reformation basically is another act of union. This is an act of union that many Scots felt was forced on them. And then in 1745 you have the Battle of Culloden Moor, a severe defeat for the Highlanders. And then from 1740 to 1790 you have the Enlightenment period. So the first war for Scottish independence, look at that guy, Mel Gibson, William Wallace. That started in 1296 and really lasted till 1328. I think most of us have seen the movie. They took some liberties with that, but basically there was a lot of truth in it. The Highlanders were really, William Wallace was supporting independence from Great Britain because the Longshanks, the king at that point of England, was really just treating the Scots pretty miserably. We don't know a lot about William Wallace and where he came from. Historians don't totally agree on this. But the things that they do know is he spoke the English well, he spoke French well, and he spoke Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic very well. So they think he came from Renfrewshire, which is basically on the western coast, right where she's kind of living on the border of the Highlands and the Lowlands. So he seemed to have sympathies in both directions and a kind of a, we got to get England out of our hair kind of an attitude, which, if you see in the movie, you can see he comes to a horrible death in 1305 when the British captured him. But that does not bring on the end of the battle for independence. The Scots continued on And it didn't really end until 1328. So, meanwhile, another battle comes along. This would be slightly after the Wallace movie. And it's in 1314, the Bannockburn battle. And this is led by Robert the Bruce, who is mentioned in the Wallace movie. And he led this battle, and they defeat the British pretty badly at that battle, which is why the Scots still celebrate it. And out of that battle came, a couple of years later, a thing called the Declaration of Aberoth, which was really a monumental thing at the time. Basically, it was our Declaration of Independence is modeled on it. If you read it, you feel like you're reading a slightly different version of our own Declaration of Independence. And in that, they appealed to the Pope at the time and said, we have a right to rule ourselves, and the Pope agreed with them. Well, you think that might have ended the battling and the War of Independence, but it really went on until 1328. And the Treaty of Edinburgh finally stops that. And they have won their right to be free of England. But it's still rocky. So there's Robert the Bruce, a forensic sculptor named Christian Corbett put this together. And he dies shortly after the Treaty of Edinburgh. But he's responsible, he's a real hero for the success in that Battle of Bannockburn. So, meanwhile, a guy named John Knox is in the background. And he was really, he had a kind of a rough life. The British had imprisoned him at one point. And he despised nobility of all kinds, stripes. He despised the Catholic Church and popery. And he was pretty much against any kind of collective fund. You'd think, how did he manage to convince people to do what he wanted them to do? He was responsible for bringing the Calvinistic Presbyterianism to Scotland. He was extremely successful in the Lowlands, and the Highlanders said, we don't really want too much to do with you. And they kind of never got into it. But you wonder, how did he convert the most? Usually if you think about any authoritarian person, because we're very authoritarian, who manages to gain some kind of a leadership role, they're giving the people something that they want. And what did he give them? Well, before, with the Catholic Church, you couldn't receive communion unless you were paying to receive communion by tithing to the church. The Catholic Church had really done nothing to promote education in any way. The stained glass windows, you may realize, their purpose was to educate the masses about the Bible rather than having them read the Bible themselves. And John Knox comes along and says, wait a minute, we have to start teaching people how to read so that they can read the Bible for themselves. This turns out to be sort of a mistake on his part in terms of Presbyterianism, because as people started to read, they start to think. And he was very much against people thinking. He wanted them to have a specific idea, his idea of what worshiping God was all about. For him, God was a vengeful figure, not a loving God like most of Christianity preaches today. And you were born a sinner, and you were going to kind of stay a sinner unless you sort of tried to behave, and maybe that wouldn't even work for you. It was just a rough time. And the other thing he did was, so with communion, he came along, and there was liberal wine given out at communion at a lot of these services. I read at one point there was a church service where 8 gallons of wine were consumed by a very small congregation. On top of that, the communion wafer, in many cases, was Scottish shortbread. Well, that's one of my favorite foods. not the communion wafer that most of us might be familiar with. So he's teaching people to read and making communion available to the masses. And the other thing they were doing, a poor woman really would have trouble finding a marriage partner because she didn't have a dowry. Well, John Knox said, we're going to come collectively together as community, a Christian community, and we are going to provide dowries for these young women so that they can find husbands. So he was giving out good stuff. And what was he doing that was so bad? Well, you could easily be killed for blasphemy. And blasphemy was any diversion from his idea of what worship should be like. So this all kind of comes to a head for him in this guy named Thomas Aikenhead. He was a theology student, and he was starting to, he'd been taught to read and been reading the Bible, and he's a theology student, and he's starting to think, he doesn't really go along with some of these ideas that John Knox has been talking about and what the Presbyterians have been talking about. And he's starting to reason for himself, and he said, God is just part of nature. He's always been here. He's existed since eternity. And Presbyterians used a term called latitudism to describe people that had liberal thoughts like this. And he winds up being tried and killed for being a blasphemer. And this is just one of the, many people have been killed before him, but this was the dawn of enlightenment, and people are beginning to think, and things are beginning to fall a little bit apart for John Knox and the Presbyterians. Also, witches were being burned at the stake all the time during the heyday of this Calvinistic approach to Christianity. And it was such a violent period that it became known as the killing time. Because anybody with a divergent thought was just at risk of being put to death. Sometimes in very horrible and brutal ways. So they actually had this thing called the Blasphemy Act passed in 1650. That was a Presbyterian thing where the punishments by death sentence were now officially carried out. And there was a guy called this Lord Advocate who was in charge of deciding whether you lived or died, if you were a blasphemer or a witch. And just kind of a rough time to be on this planet. So, backtrack a little bit. In 1609, there was a thing called the Statutes of Iona. So, Lowlanders, these kind of radical Calvinistic Presbyterians, many of them at this point, decide it's really their duty, their Christian duty, to reform the Highlanders. And they're going to get them to somehow come on board. They never really succeeded, but they said, in order to do this, we're going to, these Highlanders are not educating their children. We're going to pass a law that they must send their sons to the Lowlands to get an education. And the other thing they were saying, these people living in the Highlands are not producing enough food, not for the people in the Lowlands, and not generating enough income for the lairds. There's too many of them living up there, they're lazy, and we're going to have to start making the chiefs evict their family members that are unable to produce enough agricultural goods to stay on the land. So that just kind of is the background flavor of how the Lowlanders are feeling about the Highlanders. But by the 1690s, they started having horrible famine. This thing going on in Europe that historians and geologists call the Little Ice Age. The crops were terrible. People had nothing to eat. And it was an economic crisis all over Europe, but made a little bit worse in Scotland by some of the things that they were doing. And up to this point in time, oatmeal had been the mainstay of the Scottish diet. It's back to being that now. If you've ever had haggis, that's got oatmeal in it. It's a big piece of what they're all about. And the potato was introduced as a substitute, which eventually in the mid-1800s with the potato famine didn't work out too well. And the economy of Scotland was in a downward spiral, and there was significant unrest throughout Scotland. Now, the Lowlanders, the merchants, and these educated people started to realize the British at this point were ruling the seas and trade. And the merchants were having a really hard time. So in addition to all this famine and everything that's going on, the economy is in a downward spiral. And they decide they've got to get charge of all this, the merchants and some other lairds, and they're going to, they formed a thing called the Darien Company. It was started by a man named William Patterson. And he wanted to control the trade through the Panama Canal. And so he managed to get many of the wealthier people living in the lowlands to invest in what was called the Darien Company. And they wound up losing their shirts. They recruited a lot of Highlanders who were starving to death to work on these ships. They sent 4 ships to Panama. The British were not too excited that they were doing this because the British were controlling the seas, so they weren't really being very good about it. And they get there, and basically 2,000 men died in this operation. None of the ships, 4 ships, ever made it back to Scotland. And everybody, all the wealthy people in Scotland that had invested in the Darien Company lost their shirts. So as you're approaching 1700, things are really pretty bad economically in Scotland. Meanwhile, you've got all kinds of political stuff going on. In addition to the economy being in a bit of a pit, a famous thing called the Glencoe Massacre. If you've been to Scotland, you might have seen memorials to this. The Highlanders were Jacobites. They wanted Jacob to come back. They tended to be a little more in favor of Catholics. It wasn't so much that the Jacobites were Stuart fans. They just hated the Whigs and the Scottish Whig government. And basically, the Whigs plotted to have different clans fighting with one another. And this is the famous, it's like the Hatfields and McCoys of the United States. It's the Campbells and the McDonalds. And the Campbell clan goes and massacres the McDonalds. Now, to this day, there are some people that are McDonald's that would sit anywhere near somebody named Campbell at any event. There's a long-lasting hatred there. But that, and all that battle did was serve to, there was a fervor in the Highlands to have the Stuarts back in power. They wanted the Whigs out. The Whigs were passing all kinds of laws that made their lives difficult in the Highlands, and they wanted them out. It wasn't so much that they really liked the Stuarts, though. It's very complicated. So all of this poor economy, famine, bad crops, too many people living in various places, it kind of brings upon this thing called the Union of the Crowns, January 14th, 1707. And this brings us to close to the form of government that now is shared by Scotland and England. Basically, there were merchants and wealthy lairds who had lost their shirts with this Darien Company thing, who weren't doing well. The British were now really ruling the seas. They couldn't trade. They were in a bit of a mess. And so many of them went down to London and were negotiating with, it was Queen Anne at that time, and basically came up with this Articles of Union. I think it had 22 parts. They passed it down in London, and then it had to be passed by Scotland. So at this time, Scotland has its own parliament, has had its own parliament since the last time they won a battle, basically. And they have their own parliament, and part of this was that the Scots had to give up their parliament. So people in Scotland, once the masses found out about this, there was a lot of antagonism towards this union of the crowns. They just felt like they were losing everything. And nonetheless, it took over a year to pass the Union of the Crowns Act, but it manages to be passed. And what they gave up, there were 558 seats at that point in the English Parliament, and 45 of them were going to be House of Commons seats for Scotland, and 16 were going to be House of Lords, or Peers is what they called it, House of Peers, which is absolutely no representation against 558 total. And they gave all of this away in order to have unity with England to improve their trade. It turned out financially to be the best thing Scotland had ever done for themselves. But meanwhile, we've got a lot of people not happy with the whole idea. Some of these things take a while to realize that Scotland really couldn't stand by itself. It really needed England. They've been fighting for their freedom from time immemorial, and so there were just many people who couldn't buy into this new idea of that we need union with the crown again. But trade improved, the economy improved, there was more of an exchange of ideas, and the Presbyterians basically were out of the ball game, and these acts of blasphemy things and burning witches at the stake and those kinds of things wound up ceasing around this time, and the Enlightenment era really starts to take hold, and there's a lot of intellectual prosperity going on, and it's really pretty much a good place to be. But there's still a great divide. The Highlanders were never treated well by England. They felt like they hadn't gotten a good shake at all. And there was just a lot of grumbling in the Highlands. They weren't for this union at all. It's kind of like, what have we been fighting for all these years? So much blood has been shed and we've just lost everything. But there's a great paradigm shift. As I said, the Presbyterians were now being persecuted. And the Lowlands became urban centers. And the economy improved. So a talk on the Enlightenment would take a whole other PowerPoint. But these are some guys that you're probably familiar with. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations. Robert Burns, in terms of arts and literature, was really celebrating Scotland, and he wrote in a Scottish dialect, not the English dialect. So he was kind of a hero, even though these guys are all in the Lowlands. Robert Burns is kind of well loved throughout Scotland because he just championed the masses and all parts of Scotland, basically. And Francis Hutchinson, moral sentimentalism is one of the things I used to talk about him. But basically, he didn't see God as a vengeful God, he saw him as a loving God. More in line with what we think of today in Christianity. Okay, so if there's still unrest in the Highlands, things are going along smoothly in the universities and such in the Lowlands. And Bonnie Prince Charlie is a Stuart, and they want to, the Highlanders want to bring him back into power. And so they plot to have this battle at Culloden Moor. Unfortunately, the English got wind of it. Bonnie Prince Charlie, they lose the battle terribly. Bonnie Prince Charlie doesn't get put back on the throne. And the Highlanders are forced to retreat. And Bonnie Prince Charlie winds up wandering and hiding all over Scotland for several months, and finally escaping, I think, France at first. Basically, he had to run away. At one point, the MacDonald clan championed his cause, and Flora MacDonald lent Bonnie Prince Charlie some of her clothes, and he dressed up as a woman in order to escape. So, but so many men died in this battle, and it's a famous battle where the Highlanders are forced to retreat. If you're of Scottish heritage and some of your relatives came to America around that time, they were probably Highlanders who had to escape. Many people were lucky to get out with their lives. Some of them went to Northern Ireland. They got out in any way they could, and many were just slaughtered. It was a sound defeat for the Highlanders. So the British said, okay, we got to get these Highlanders under control. They're maniacs up there. They're uneducated, and we're gonna make them change their ways and change all their style of living. And this is what in 1750s when the Highland clearances begin. They just start making everybody leave. We're going to replace the people with sheep. They passed a thing called the Dress Act, where people were forbidden to wear a tartan. They kind of looked at that as the whole root of the problem, this tartan. And the other thing that was forbidden were the playing of bagpipes, because these were both instruments of war and encouraging the Highlanders to rise up against England, and we're going to just do away with that. So sheep raising becomes the main thing you see. If you go to the Highlands today, you see sheep all over the place. But at the same time, there's change in the Lowlands. The tartan winds up being reinstituted in 1782. They came to their senses and realized it really wasn't the whole problem. The Highlanders still were not unhappy people up there, and the tartan was really not the issue. And many lowland families began to develop a tartan, and many organizations developed tartans. And now the tartan today is like a big source of Scottish pride. And over time, bagpipes became part of Scottish pride. If you go to even a Scottish wedding or a Scottish funeral, you're going to hear bagpipes. And you're going to see everybody dressed in formal kilts. And so it really changed. By the 1800s, though, the Lowlanders began to realize that they didn't have very many people living in the Highlands. They had evicted everybody, forced them to leave in one way or another, made life miserable for them. And in 1803, they actually passed this thing called the Vessels Act, where it became very expensive to leave the country. And that didn't work out very well either. People kept leaving anyway. So, the Lowlands and the Highlands today. It's still a little rocky. It's been rocky since Brexit. The most recent election was held in 2021. In 1998, the Scots finally got their own parliament back. They passed an act, this Parliament Act. And so in the recent election, you had the Scottish National Party, got 62 seats. The Scottish Conservatives got 31. Labour got 22. Scottish Liberal Democrats 4. Scottish Greens 8. And the Reform UK, ALBA, and Unity parties didn't get any seats. And the Scottish National Party aligned with the Scottish Greens. And so now the Liberals basically are kind of in charge in the Scottish Parliament. It's basically the Liberals that are in favor of the Scottish National Party, you may read about it in the news, is really in favor of breaking away from England and becoming independent again. So in 2014, there was a referendum. And it just so happens that Glenn and I were in Scotland, touring. Basically, we were on a cruise of the Scottish Islands, basically, and then we came back down through Edinburgh and Glasgow. And basically, on that trip, we were hearing about the vote that was coming up and hearing, we're not breaking away from England, this would be the craziest thing. in the Orkneys, they were saying, we're going to petition to go back to Norway if they break away from England, because that was an island that had been given to the Scots by Norway. We weren't hearing anything about anybody wanting to break away from England. At the same time, we had good friends that were visiting Scotland at the same time, and they were at a MacGregor clan reunion in the Highlands. And what they were hearing up there was, we've got to break away. Now, I think they came home thinking that the boat was going to go, that they were going to break away, and we came home thinking they're not going to break away. Well, the upshot of it is they didn't break away. And this map here kind of gives you an idea of how the boat went. The blue, which is really hard to find, is the people that wanted to break away. There's a little blue here, a little blue here. They voted to break away. And then all other areas that are shades of red voted to remain part of England. You can see that the darkest red is down in the Lowlands, closer to the English border, which kind of makes sense. And as you get up into the upper regions of the Highlands, they're a little more interested in breaking away, but still they voted to remain. There are councils, area councils, and this is how the votes were coming in for there. Interesting to me is this area that's very blue here is where they think William Wallace came from and Robert the Bruce. So this is still a feeling in that area that England's never been good to us. We need to get out of this town. So those are some resources I used. I highly recommend the book, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. It's really, if you want to learn more about the Enlightenment, it's a good place to look. And also is gives a pretty good description of what's going on in terms of politics historically, not politics today, but politics historically. So that's that. Thank you.